Hi everyone. Today we are going to talk to the former journalist turned author. He wrote 3 books. The first about Vietnam, the second about the South China Sea, and the latest one about the invention of China. Today we're going to discuss the invention of China itself, the invention of its territory, the invention of maritime claims, and the invention of its sovereignty. Please welcome Bill Hayton. It's a fantastic book. It's a very interesting interview. Welcome to the show. You mention in the book the number and rank of foreign delegations confirm domestically the mandate of heaven. I would like now to discuss the other chapter, Invention of the Han race, and then you mentioned the HuaQiao, and you're saying that that's rather a cultural and racial description, and all Chinese, no matter what their nationality, they are Chinese, no matter where they live, which passport they have. And according to one official a long time ago, he said that HuaQiao, they only live abroad temporary, because they will come to China, they're all Chinese. And we could see it years ago with Gary Locke, who was the first Chinese-American ambassador in China, and he had problems because they expected him, both the government and the society, they said, hey, you're Chinese. Why are you representing the Americans? And I think that's also a problem nowadays with the Chinese communities abroad, because the Chinese government expects them, to kowtow and to be really Chinese, to help them and serve them. Is that right?
I think so, and I think, as you were hinting, it goes back to a racial idea of what it is to be Chinese. And these, I think, there are some, kind of 19th century or even earlier kind of roots to this, but really, a lot of it comes out to do with the interaction of racial thinking, from sort of Western, ideas about races in the late 19th century, and that's the impact of that on Chinese nationalist thinking. And I think you can still see the impression of those racial ideas in Chinese national thinking today, such that Chinese diplomats will go around the world sort of claiming to speak on behalf of Chinese communities in other countries. And of course, that causes problems if you're the Chinese community in Malaysia or Indonesia or other countries, and you're already, subject to some suspicion, some racism maybe, kind of where do your loyalties really lie? And then along comes the Chinese ambassador and says, you're all Chinese, I can tell from the color of your hair and the color of your eyes. Then that obviously makes life much worse for them. So I think it's a real problem. I don't think the Chinese government have really thought of a way that they can deal with these communities as anything other than being, blood Chinese, as it were. And I think that this is going to be a lingering problem, for some time.
Okay, next chapter, the invention of the national territory. And here you're talking about how the Qing court lost Taiwan and the pescadores, and that it's been a humiliation for the court. But they just considered it a dangerous frontier with some wild aborigines. And then since that time, we have tons of examples of lack of interest and any significance with regards to Taiwan, that China didn't really care. And it all started changing about 100 years ago. So I wanted to ask you, why such a neurosis nowadays? Why is the CCP so obsessed with Taiwan? Is it because it's free and democratic, or is it maybe because of the military significance?
I think there's a few parts to it, and I think the military significance is one. I mean, clearly, if Taiwan did become part of the People's Republic of China, that would change the strategic situation in East Asia quite dramatically. It would mean that the PRC had access to the open waters of the Pacific, and that must be part of their calculation. But actually, I think it's at a kind of emotional level. I think it's really about territory and about this idea of reunifying the historic territory of China. which of course is ironic because in 1895, at the end of the Sino-Japanese War, the old Qing state signed away Taiwan to Japan, and Taiwan was ruled as a Japanese colony for the next 50 years until 1945. And all the evidence we have is that during that time, the Chinese political class, in effect, forgot about Taiwan. It was gone. It was, you see maps in atlases don't color in Taiwan. Discussions about railway systems, for example, don't include Taiwan. So it's not as if there's a lingering desire during the 1920s, 30s that we must have Taiwan back. It's only, and in the reading I've done, in 1942 that Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang start to think that they could get Taiwan back from Japan because America has entered the Second World War. It looks like Japan might lose, and they're starting to think about the post-war situation. But even when Chiang Kai-shek is writing his book China's Destiny, or rather it's being ghost-written for him, he's not really talking about Taiwan as part of the motherland. He's talking about it as like a buffer zone, a defense for the motherland. So you have the motherland, the mainland, if you like, of China, and then these outlying areas like Taiwan and Xinjiang and Tibet, which are protecting the motherland. So even there, it's not really a kind of emotional, this place is historically ours. It's still this kind of idea that it's a bit of a frontier. But I think since then, the idea of territory has and the importance of overturning what Chinese politicians call the century of national humiliation, of kind of getting back all the territory which was in theory at least stolen by foreigners, that we get this obsession with Taiwan. I mean, it started off obviously, from after 1949, that it was about extinguishing the old nationalist Kuomintang regime. But I think since then it's taken on a more symbolic status as ending the century of national humiliation in the same way as gathering all the rocks and reefs in the South China Sea and sorting out the border with India in the Himalayas. And that only when the PRC occupies all the territory within this line will, China have been rejuvenated. And of course, this is Xi Jinping's great slogan, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people.
Okay, follow-up question. How, in that case, in this situation, how could we tell the real story to the world? Like people who don't deal with it every day. How could we tell them, because not everybody will read the book, unfortunately. So what can we do so more people know about the real situation?
Well, it's a good question. And part of the difficulty is in order to understand it, you do have to really kind of unpack a lot of historical information that people have absorbed over many years. I think one way is simply to stop talking about this part of East Asia before 1912 as China, to use the terms that we used at the time. So you talk about the Qing Great State, you talk about the Ming State before that. To recognize that these were actually different political arrangements. Even, for example, when we talk about minorities within China, well, of course, they're only minorities within China because the political system changed during the 20th century. I mean, when Tibet was de facto independent between 1912 and 1950, there was no Tibetan minority because Tibet was self-ruled. But obviously, once China took over Tibet in 1950, these people then became a Tibetan minority, and you could say the same thing about Mongolia and Xinjiang as well. So we need to remember that that history is written and rewritten, and that the version of history that we're receiving is a version that was written around the turn of the 20th century in the 1900s, 1910s. And it was written for a purpose, which was to show that all of these people were Chinese, all of the land was Chinese, and so forth. And we were very happy to believe that, in the West collectively, because it fitted in with our ideas of China too. And so we lost a lot of the complexity. And obviously the consequence of that is, we've seen in Xinjiang in the last few years, is that if you want to, try to shape the minds of 1 million Uyghurs. You put them in detention camps and you basically try and insist that they define themselves as Chinese in order to make this vision of history, a contemporary reality. That's kind of what it takes, is the mass incarceration of 1 million people just to get them to believe in this simple idea.
Okay, that builds a bridge to the last chapter, the invention of the maritime claim, and I think that's really fascinating because you go in you discuss in depth how Chinese cartographers and geographers screwed up, how they really having no idea about the islands in the Pacific, how they pretended that they got so much wrong. So you start with the James Shoal, that is like the most extreme place of Chinese territory next to Malaysia. And then you discuss the problems that the Philippines and Vietnam have, and you're saying that it's mostly due to poor translation and bad map making. And then you describe this committee in the beginning of 1930s that couldn't undertake their own surveys, but so they checked earlier maps and books, and they translated literally English names marked on British maps, and those contain the same mistakes like in the initial source in 1906. And as a result, some other underwater features were turned into islands because that's what they thought, that's what they imagined. And now in 1935, this committee created a map that was then later became, like a source of knowledge about the Chinese territory. And just to finish this, in 1947, all those names were then translated from this Chinglish, like this translation from English to Chinese, again into English to consider foreign origins. That's really a fascinating topic. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so there was a sense that China wanted to claim some of these islands. I mean, it starts in 1909 when it claims the Paracel Islands, and then a series of disputes with foreign powers, with Japan and with France. And the people running the Republic of China realize they don't actually know very much about these islands, so they commission basically some research. And it's all done on maps and translations. And the real problem, which you alluded to with this place called the James Shoal, is that it's underwater. It's very underwater. It's 22 meters below the surface of the sea.
Yes.
But they translate the word shoal, which is an old English word that means shallow, and they use a Chinese word tan, which means a sandbank. Now, a sandbank could be underwater or it could stick up out of the water in different places. And so the next group of people come along and they go, oh, it's a tan, it's a sandbank, it must stick up out of the water. And they look, and I can't prove this, but I think they use a map that I've seen, which has like a dotted line around this feature. And then the next person that comes along turns that dotted line into a solid line and colors it in. And it basically, just by doing that, he creates the idea that there's actually a real island there when there isn't an island there. And then somebody else comes along later and says, well, if there's this island here, then it's, and it's visited by our fishermen, then it must belong to China. And so this is what I mean by these translation and these map making problems, which have really given us this terrible legacy that now China, claims it's going to, defend these non-existent islands and that they are historically always part of Chinese territory. But really, it's a series of errors that emerged in the 1930s and 1940s.
At one moment, I'm not sure I got it right, but at one moment you mentioned that those cartographers, they started creating maps in the 30s in Germany and in Japan. And that's how they got this feeling of this, expanding territorial expansion. And so I'm thinking, could we build a link from those 30s in Germany and Japan, and nowadays the CCP promoting those views, that there is kind of a link with the Nazi ideology and kind of, superiority?
It would be an interesting thing to go and examine that in detail, but it is true that these two geographers were being taught in Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in the 30s. So they must have, taken on some of these ideas about the nature of territory and the historic, living space and all the rest of it, the things that were being taught in these universities at the time. I can't make a direct connection, but it seems highly likely that if that's the sort of situation that you're studying in, those are the ideas that you're going to absorb.
I have 2 or 3 more questions. Now, when you published the book, what was the reaction to it? Let's say from the media, from scholars, like how did they react? How did they comment on it?
Well, I think from scholars, I mean, this is basically what I've done is taken what I think now would be a fairly standard, university undergraduate introduction to Chinese nationalism, and I've tried to kind of make it acceptable, sort of, to a general audience by kind of, talking about the people and the characters, and maybe make it into a sort of more of a sort of story form, so that you can follow, not just the individuals, but the world in which they were living, the ideas and the politics that's going on around them. So, from scholars on the academic side, that's been great. I've obviously upset a few Chinese nationalists for whom, they demand that this is the only way of looking at the world is their way, that the nation has always been there, the territory has always been the same, and all this kind of stuff. But I find, very difficult to kind of convince people to kind of look at their own beliefs as basically a product of a particular time and place. That's not really how they look at the world. They like certainty, whatever. But I kind of think it's sort of, there has been a change in the way now that we talk about China. We get less discussion of the kind of the historical certainty that there's the permanent presence of China. So I think maybe it's kind of seeped into the discussion a little bit. I hope so, anyway.
Since you mentioned the Chinese, do you think that, like, the CCP elites, are they aware of it? Like, do they really believe it? Is there any like reflection, or they just really believe that's how it is, that's the truth, and maybe that's why they are so committed to it?
I think so. I mean, I think this is the version of history that's taught in Chinese schools and repeated at Chinese universities, and inculcated in the media and in the Communist Party's think tanks. I don't think there are any prizes for trying to go against that prevailing narrative. In fact, I think it can be very, damaging to your career to try and question it. And the Communist Party puts a lot of effort into for example, the Institute of Qing Studies at Renmin University in Beijing, where they're trying to sort of interpret the past in a way that reinforces the Communist Party view of history. And historians that have tried to raise questions have been denounced, called historical nihilists or nihilists, and they've had problems. So I think the message has gone out very firmly that don't risk trying to challenge this narrative.
Thank you. That was really a great interview. I have to say, I loved the book. It's absolutely fantastic for a few reasons. One, that it's really, everybody can understand it. You don't need to be a China scholar or sinologist. And it's very, with a simple, easily understandable language. And most of all, you can tell how much research went into it. So that's also really impressive.
Thank you very much indeed. I mean, what I did was try and read all of this academic material and sort of make it available to everybody.
Okay, thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure.
Thank you for watching the video. Interview. If you want more, like it. Please let me know in the comments, who should I talk to next time? And if you didn't like it, share it.